Net zero seems still like a distant dream, but we are so focused on it, at least in terms of talking about it, that maybe it'll happen just by sheer will. We'll manifest it and accomplish it. But this is about roadblocks to net zero, 6 roadblocks to net zero, and how to get around them. As a prop, here is the Mammoth carbon removal plant in near Reykjavik, using geothermal energy to extract carbon dioxide from the air and store it in bedrock. So the drawing down carbon from the air is always difficult because it's 0.04% concentration, so you have to move through a lot of air to extract small amounts of CO2. But if the energy to do that is free like geothermal, then you can keep it running and hope to scale it up in the meantime, right? So overcoming the obstacles, 6 obstacles that we'll look at in carbon markets can speed up decarbonization. So now it says obstacles in carbon markets as opposed to net zero, so you have to be careful. Net zero, this is simple accounting term representing humanity's greatest challenge and opportunity to stabilize Earth's climate. The goal, the timeline, and metric for success seem clear. By 2050, each ton of carbon emitted must be matched by a ton removed, but achieving this is easier said than done. Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the world has built up more than 250 years of momentum in carbon-emitting economy and technology paradigm. Now, under the terms of the 2015 Paris Agreement, we set the goals, and we want to hit those goals of staying below 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C. And what we do in the next coming decade or 25 years is going to matter a lot for where we will be by 2100. Journey requires unprecedented coordination, innovation, investment, and speed to avoid catastrophic consequences of failure. So these words are kind of subjective. Catastrophic, it's not a scientific term here, but you will have a lot of challenges for sure to all sectors, especially food and water, and of course energy, because our lifestyles are so energy intensive. So we, the authors, I cut out the author list, which is fairly wrong, understand the potential and pitfalls, having spent more than 20 years between us developing the strategies, programs, products, and policies that are achieving net zero demand. So it's their personal claim to expertise as well. We have deployed and influenced more than $1 billion in investments and purchases related to carbon reduction and removal, and have been on the front lines of driving large-scale voluntary decarbonization in the corporate sector. So let's take their accomplishments as an indicator that they know what they're talking about in terms of roadblocks and ways to get around them. Previously, we served as principal architects of Microsoft's carbon negative commitment. Now one of us is a net zero strategy consultant, and the other is a private equity executive working to deliver a net zero investment portfolio. So impact investments, where you don't just invest for profit, but you also worry about impacts like net zero. Although we have a deep conviction that net zero can work, we know it has issues: a premature desire for perfection, overly precise guidelines for implementation, and insufficient flexibility in carbon accounting, as well as unhelpful constraints on collaboration and a disproportionate focus on the actions of others will combine to slow down the net zero transformation just when it needs to speed up. Here we describe the barriers and suggest ways to overcome them. So people tend to be skeptical about private sector people talking about saving the planet, but it's no doubt that the public-private sectors have to work together on this massive challenge. So I won't use catastrophic, but it's a monumental challenge. A carbon transport ship in Norway takes waste carbon dioxide from industrial process to a storage facility near Bergen. So when you hear Iceland and Norway, you think of small, rich, homogeneous countries which can do these things. What about the rest of the world? So then we have to think about obstacles to the market growth. For net zero to work, the world must design markets in which every product or service everywhere prices in the cost of removing carbon dioxide as the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or replacing them with an alternative that emits little or no carbon. Okay, that's we must design markets for all. These regulations will play a crucial part, but adoption at scale will happen only when removals and low carbon alternatives are cheaper in price, superior in performance, and or both relative to higher carbon incumbents who are already there. So per ton CO2 removal costs are typically considered, very economically attractive when they are below about $100, let's say. Lower the better, but right now it could be several $100. Reduction and removal technologies are still in their infancy. Sustainable aviation fuel, green hydrogen and steel, low carbon concrete and technologies that capture CO2 from the air are expected to be part of a future net zero economy. So they are going to be part of the portfolio of solutions. If it happens, then you still have to worry about reducing emissions, because CO2, putting it out and taking it out is not the same as emitting it for the ocean, for ecosystems, for us, and so on. Long-term cost efficiencies and supply will emerge only through large investments in a host of approaches, allowing the markets to determine winners and losers. So these are obviously market force heroes. This was a clear lesson from decades of advances in solar and wind energy, which ultimately saw the cost of these renewables plummet by more than 70%. And there are articles talking about artificial penetration of these technologies based on subsidies. Will they survive on their own? Will they manage to replace fossil fuels 100%? And so on are still questions. To meet net zero goals, global investments in the clean energy and carbon removal sectors and their supporting infrastructure must exceed 4 trillion annually by 2030. So these estimates are always based on some assumptions, but nonetheless we are concerned that the current carbon market expectations are inadvertently making it harder, not easier, to deploy the climate capital needed to build robust carbon markets. How so? Despite widespread agreement on the need for net zero, few binding requirements compel individuals or organizations to act in support of climate goals. This creates a carbon catch-22. Catch-22. Governments are hesitant to impose regulations without a clear price signal from the market, while markets struggle to deliver price clarity without regulatory guidance. So they both have to dance together. As a result, achieving net zero globally must rely heavily on early movers, organizations that pursue net zero outcomes voluntarily without worrying about the market and benefits and so on right now. But so far there are too few of these, and they aren't moving quickly enough. In part, that's because the net zero landscape is dominated by prescriptive rules that are difficult to implement, often creating confusion instead of clarity. These roadblocks must be removed, and here we identify 6 remedies. When private sector says regulations are just creating problems, usually it means they want to play around or get rid of the rules, and the rules may have public safety and other factors in mind, and market forces will always say nothing to worry about. So we have to be clear about whether the motivations here are as clean and simple as they appear to be. Pursue progress over perfection. Organizations need flexibility if they are going to commit to innovation. Of course, this is, and they keep giving the renewable energy example, but as I said, how the subsidies twisted the markets for renewables is to be figured out when we want to use the same approach for net zero. Procurement of unbundled renewable energy certificates was replaced by more sophisticated ways to buy and sell energy, such as through contracts to match hourly energy consumption. So whenever strong recommendations are made to loosen regulations, then you have to be careful. Similarly, today's corporate leaders are advancing energy projects on a voluntary basis, from nuclear to geothermal. Their energy prices are high now, but will come down if buyers and suppliers are given room to improve the technologies. In other words, setting an ambitious but achievable goal and sticking with it while continuously improving its execution should be a core principle for reaching net zero. So rigid and complex standards introduced too soon are discouraging companies. So it's obviously hammering regulations. Delisting or penalizing companies for missing arbitrary net zero milestones should be avoided. So oversight is asked to be reduced. Science-based target initiatives working group should recommend that flexibility and iteration are core pillars of its forthcoming revision to the corporate net zero standard. So second one, prioritize direct over indirect emissions, which means if you think of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, what you are directly emitting to produce a product that you are delivering to the market, as opposed to the emissions that follow after that in terms of transportation and so on and so forth. So let me stop a second. My phone is ringing. I know who it is, I think, but I need to take it. Okay, as I guessed, it's a friend calling about our plan for travel in the Himalayas during the end of September and early October. I love going to the Himalayas, and you always have to pick the seasons properly to avoid miserable weather and rain and so on. So anyway, so here prioritize direct over indirect emissions, and they talk about scope 2 and scope 3. As we said, scope 1 includes organizations' direct emissions such as those from a steel producer, coal-powered kiln. Scope 2 reflects those associated with consuming electricity as well as heating and cooling. Scope 3 emissions represent all those embodied in an organization's supply chain, product delivery networks. So for most companies, scope 3 captures most of their emissions. Accounting for these has helped to drive a cascade of decarbonization commitments, such as identifying, addressing or replacing high carbon producers. That's good, but a disproportionate focus on reporting scope 3 emissions, including SBTi, Science Based Targets Initiative, the CDP, an international non-profit organization dedicated to collecting information on corporate sustainability efforts, and jurisdictions such as the United States and the European Union, has arguably distracted many companies from doing the hard work at home. In 2022, only 7% of consumer companies were on track to meet their targets for value chain decarbonization, and only 18% were on track with their direct emissions targets. So, this is again a market force people saying weaken the regulations. Who will worry about scope 3? This is something that has to be brought in. You can say the producer doesn't have to worry about the supply chain emissions, but then there has to be a way to also somebody to be in charge of worrying about supply chain emissions, right? Maybe that can be considered as scope 1 and 2 for the consumer end of things. Okay. Secondly, a focus on scope 3. So first, they say requiring companies to commit reductions has little, they have little or no control on the supply side, or the supply chain side, so they shouldn't be penalized. And secondly, focus on scope 3 introduces extreme uncertainty into reporting of carbon emissions. Again, sounds like a way to get out of it. The biggest error could be to build a system that discourages companies from doing anything at all. So this is obviously a very, very tilted kind of approach. And the third, in scope 3 emissions can potentially divert focus away from scope 1 and 2. Do you really believe it? I'm skeptical about this claim. So fix is simple. SBTi, CDP, regulators and other parties should create a tiered system that prioritizes target setting and reporting for scope 1 and 2 over that for scope 3. I'll leave it because I read the paper. I'm a bit skeptical about this entire direction of saying reduce regulations to ensure imperfect solution, and don't let regulations be focused on perfection and hence paralyze the system. Wow, let's leave it there. Engineers work on electrical panels at Octavia Carbon, a carbon capture plant near Nairobi. So it's good that even Kenya is worried about carbon capture. The third one here is focus on demand over delivery. Corporate demand has had an outsized role in developing renewable energy markets. Starting in the 2010s, companies were motivated to make purchases because they were because they received credit for doing so under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but the protocol's accounting practices contain an inconsistency. Under its location-based and market-based accounting rules, companies can get credit for Scope 2 carbon reductions from the electricity they consumed by purchasing renewable energy that is never physically delivered to them, but there is no mechanism to do that for Scope 1 or 3. So allowing companies to claim credit for the purchases for Scope 3 would incentivize them to invest. To build trust, descriptions of the projects funded or financed can help others to assess the value of any company's carbon reduction and removal purchases. Overall, whatever the rule changes being suggested here, if it can really accelerate to us towards net zero, then it will be good. But the point of the regulations is to protect the environment and the public at large. So that must be a goal as well, and not just net zero. We cannot have a tunnel vision on net zero and not worry about other normative issues like equity, justice, unintended consequences on people, especially the vulnerable ones, right? Allow flexibility between emissions reduction and removal. So again, another kind of loosening of the idea. So do you really need to be responsible for removing emissions, or can you be allowed to just do reductions? The idea of a carbon trap is that emissions reduction paradigm has not worked. The emissions are going up and up. We don't show any sign of bending the curve, but decarbonizing the system means net zero and carbon removal as opposed to emissions reductions. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has emphasized, limiting the worst harms of global warming requires both reduction of emissions and large-scale carbon removal. In the context of global net zero, how much reduction is needed versus how much removal is an open question, but oil companies also say, don't worry, we'll capture carbon and it will be okay to emit. But it's not a linear problem where emitted carbon removed has impacts. They have to be quantified as well. Plus, we are not there in terms of carbon capture to accomplish this, to keep allowing emissions while carbon capture keeps scaling up. Okay. For example, SBTi is Science-Based Targets Initiative. Just remember that. SBTi's corporate net zero standard requires a company's decarbonization commitment to include a pledge to reduce their emissions by 90% or more before relying on carbon removal technologies to counterbalance the remaining 10%. This requirement is too strict and too early. Maybe too early is correct. Too strict is basically that you wait till technology is in place to reduce emissions rapidly as well as to capture carbon. So there is a very good point to be made that carbon capture cannot be a substitute for reducing emissions because of all these non-linearities in the system. Okay, some might worry that this would allow companies to avoid carbon reduction efforts and rely solely on carbon removal alone to achieve net zero. In practice, there would probably be a spectrum of corporate activities, with some relying heavily on reduction, some on removal, and most on a combination of the two that meets their individual needs and preferred price point. The SBTis and regulators could negotiate different reduction recommendations by sector. Companies should transparently report the details of any carbon removal purchases they use in terms of offsets, right? So it's not just emissions reduction. You can do offsets where you are not able to reduce or unwilling to reduce, or say technology is not available to reduce, and so on and so forth. Next up is, in terms of a net zero, barrier to net zero, promote adoption over additionality. This is tricky because when you say carbon capture, you have to take out CO2 more than naturally would occur. If you are planting a forest as offset, then you have to show that forest is new and it's taking out additional carbon. Okay, so before carbon removal became popular, leading companies relied mainly on avoided emissions offsets to zero out their remaining emissions. These offsets were obtained by paying a third party that was emitting carbon into the atmosphere to stop. These avoided emissions could then be credited as reductions under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this company is emitting, but it's paying someone else to reduce their emissions because they can do it, right? Proving that the third party stopped emitting only because of that financing, also known as additionality, became an important criterion, because if that company was anyway going to reduce its emissions and they are just taking money saying we will do it for you, then actually is misleading, right? So you have to be careful about that. A corporation paying to help finance the closure of coal plants and replace them with renewable energy would not get credit from these bodies if the coal company was going to shut down anyway because of economic or policy considerations. So are you accelerating a closure that was anyway underway? So this becomes tricky when you want to look for additionality. This is true for other things as well, as foresting, afforestation, reduced deforestation, or agroforestry for sequestering additional carbon into the soils, and so on and so forth. Bodies exist to certify and register valid offsets, including the US-based non-profit organizations American Carbon Registry, Verra, and Climate Action Reserve, and the Swiss non-profit Gold Standard. Okay, these are tricky because you have to make sure nobody is cheating in the system, right? So this additionality precedent has now been widely adopted for carbon removal markets and is included in the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, for example. This sounds good in theory, but doing so is in strictly the same way as avoided emissions offsets is counterproductive. I won't read the rest of it because you by now know that these are capitalists, marketing people or market people who are basically saying regulations are too strict, we need to relax them. I'm never comfortable with that tunnel vision. Okay. Instead, carbon removal purchases should borrow from the Scope 2 practices of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which differentiate offset emissions reductions from those related to usage associated with electricity generation. So there are some details on how you do the accounting of offsets, and they are obviously arguing for more room in selling offsets as a real reduction in emissions. Support collaboration over competition. Because net zero technologies are often the first of their kind, many of them are expensive. They can make it hard for a corporation to buy them in large quantities, which reduces the demand and slows down the cost efficiency improvements that can be delivered through high volume production. Collaborations across corporate sustainability teams on net zero purchases can help to rectify this, turning the relatively small individual purchases into large pooled ones. Here, researchers are testing how much carbon can be stored in seagrasses off the coast of Turkey. So if that's going to be an offset, then you have to show that you grew more seagrasses than otherwise would have happened anyway. Okay, so there are more details here on how to support collaboration over competition. So this work is sometimes slowed down by legal concerns about competition law, which limits the ability of organizations to aggregate their purchasing power and accelerate the supply of climate solutions through increased demand. Governments can help by issuing clear guidance. For example, in 2023, the UK Competition and Markets Authority issued guidelines on green agreements that spell out when cross-sectoral collaboration can happen while maintaining the positive benefits of market competition. So it's capitalism, but not free for all. You always regulate the markets in some way to avoid monopolies and so on. The European Commission has followed suit, encouraging companies to approach it for guidance on such sustainability agreements. These precedents can serve as models for other countries and jurisdictions seeking to balance the benefits of collaboration and competition appropriately during the net zero transition. So this point is a little bit more subtle than just saying relax regulations. Moving forward, allowing some organizations to stumble in their net zero journey is not the biggest error that the world can make. The biggest error would be to build a system that discourages companies from doing anything at all, and they are just aiming at regulations as the cause, which we should all be a little bit uncomfortable with. These 6 remedies are intended to avoid that, making it practical for as many organizations as possible to engage voluntarily with the net zero transformation. Corporations and civil society both have a part to play, both should demand and provide transparency in their efforts. Companies should move ahead quickly by doing, showing, and continuously improving their work, and organizations such as the SBTi and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and others should provide guardrails that allow the flexibility this transition requires. Achieving net zero is not about having perfect solutions from the beginning. It's about making progress as quickly as possible by allowing markets to drive rapid iterations of the investments and innovations. That's how collectively we'll make net zero work. So that's the nail in the coffin, allowing markets to drive rapid innovations, rapid iterations of investment and innovations. So it's very much coming from a bottom-up market force kind of solution versus top-down regulations by the governments, but the sweet spot is going to be somewhere in the middle and not a market force that's going to determine everything for net zero. And how we get there without worrying about all the regulations that are meant to actually safeguard many broader interests that market forces don't necessarily worry about, like the normative questions about equity, justice, unintended consequences, protecting the vulnerable, and so on. Okay, so I wanted to include it just because it sounds nice, makes sense, and it appeared in Nature, so you think, wow, that's going to be a solid scientific thing, and it's got valid points, but as I said, it's a bit of a tunnel vision on reducing government's roles and role of regulations. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with that, just to put it on record. Okay, see you.